I'm Bill Beachum. I'm a friend of the King family, specifically Mark King. Mark and I kind of grew up together. We played baseball and football at Seaholm. And I'm fully aware of what happened in the Oakland County child killings because I grew up with it too. Mark and I were both in ninth grade. I remember Mark was wrestling over at Covington. I went to Covington and Mark went to Derby. And I remember that day, I know he wrestled Tim Hogan, a friend of mine and a teammate, and Mark was obviously distraught and distracted, but he was certainly a trooper to wrestle that day. It was a really troubling time for everybody in the community. We all wanted to help, but you just don't know what to do, because we were kids at the time, and sometimes you don't want to bring it up, sometimes you do. But our hearts went out to the King family and Mark in particular. And he and Chris, I know Chris a little bit too, and great guys, and I just feel for them. So my background, I'm a former police officer with Indianapolis PD, and also an FBI agent here in Detroit. One day, probably I guess it was about 3 years ago, I reached out to Mr. King, and it was awkward because you don't want to interfere, but I thought maybe I could help, and I approached him. And I'm a former FBI, so I'm not current FBI, just so you know. And I talked to Mr. King. We had a nice conversation. Eventually, he gave me about 3,000 plus pages of FOIA information that he had requested and gotten over the years. And I basically went through all that information, took copious notes on it, asked a lot of questions. I even met with one of the Wayne County prosecutors and one of the investigators, and I had some suggestions and some questions for them, and they were pretty helpful as much as they could be. And then eventually, I decided that for 3,000 pages, it's very difficult for anybody to go through that and figure out, what's really going on here. And I just tried to figure out the facts. So what I did is I put it in a probable cause format or a summary, which basically just gets to the facts and tells the story like, a person off the street could read and go, okay, I know what happened. So the main focus was on an individual named Christopher Busch. He had an accomplice by the name of Gregory Green. Both these guys were really bad guys, pedophiles. Christopher Busch had 4 separate CSC cases, or criminal sexual assault cases, against him at the time of what we believe was the abduction of Timmy, that he was involved. Ironically, Christopher Busch lived near my neighborhood in Bloomfield Village. He was the son of a GM executive, and it certainly appears that he got some preferential treatment from the judges and so forth. Ironically, I think I actually might have delivered his paper, because I was a paper boy, and back in the day with the Free Press when they let kids do that. And an interesting note as well is I believe that I saw Christopher Busch. I mean, I was only probably 10 or 11 years old, but there's an individual that I remember at the Tiny Tim's hobby shop, which is all connected. In fact, that was where Jill Robinson's bike was found after her abduction and murder. And I believe I saw Christopher Busch there because he was short, heavy, had they say mutton chops or the beard. And it makes sense to me because everything happened in the Woodward corridor. Where Timmy was abducted, where the other victims were abducted, it all happened near Woodward. And so it makes sense to me that these guys, they didn't have the internet back then, so they would go where the kids were. I mean, they went to the 7-Eleven, they went to Hunter Maple Pharmacy, and they went to Tiny Tim's. And I think that they stalked kids that were alone. I know that Jill Robinson, she left her house. She got in an argument with her mother. I believe it was the same case or something similar to when Christine Mihalik left too. Timmy's circumstances were different. He just went up to get some candy. But I believe in Timmy's case that the killers were already there because it's a 5-minute walk from here. There's no way that Timmy was abducted off the street off of Adams because it would take him 5 minutes to get to the Hunter Maple Pharmacy. And what witnesses are saying is that he was talking to an individual there who was a younger guy, probably in his 20s, and he was skateboarding and apparently somehow befriended Timmy for a minute or two at least. And there was a good witness that saw Timmy and this individual. Plus, there was an older man sitting in a car. I believe it was like a 1972 Le Mans. And then this individual went into Kroger, came back out, and Timmy was gone. So he is the best witness, and in fact, that didn't turn up until recently. That information and this business about there being a gremlin that was the infamous car, that was the abduction car, is probably absolutely false. Frankly, that should have been, they should have put out information that it was at Le Mans. And being former law enforcement, I understand that you don't want to tip your hand and tip off the bad guys, but if you can't get them within 24 hours, they should have put the information out. I mean, you've seen what recent events here with the Boston Marathon. You get the information out there, and you're probably going to get them. So they should have done that. They didn't. They had a different strategy. It didn't work. I can basically go through. There's a mountain of information, but what I'd like to do is just maybe summarize how this all came about. And it's basically, they call it the recent investigation, started in 2006. As you know, the abductions occurred in the late 70s, but there was a good break in the case. It was about 6 years ago now, where a friend of the family, who happened to be a polygrapher, was out at a conference in Las Vegas, and ironically talked to another polygrapher who was kind of boasting, if you will, which I think is kind of sick, but he was boasting that he took the confession of the Oakland County child killer. And he didn't know who he was talking to, but he was talking to a friend of the King's, and this individual didn't know what to do, frankly, because I think there is some legalities where, if somebody tells you something in confidence, you may not be able to disclose it. Eventually he did. He turned it over to, I think he called Kathy King, and then Kathy called, I'm not sure how I got to, Detective Corey Williams in Livonia, and he did a fantastic job, by the way. He was a tremendous investigator. And then the case goes on from there, but there's an individual, his name is Larry Wasser. This is the one that supposedly took the confession about that Christopher Busch did. And there's a lot of details involved there. But Wasser was confronted by Detective Williams or Sergeant Williams about this, and he backed up. He said, "No, I didn't say that." However, he knew lots of facts about Christopher Busch, that he had a cottage up north, that he committed suicide. His father was a GM executive. Knew everything but his name, which is just that's more than a coincidence, and we don't think he was telling the truth. There's certainly probable cause to believe that Christopher Busch was involved. He may not be the sole perpetrator. I mean, I think he had some help from Gregory Green, and there were others. He had multiple victims, and we believe that some of his victims, one in particular, was probably an accomplice as well, and that would be in the murder and abduction of Christine Mihalik. I guess what I'd like to do now, though, is maybe just hit the key points of the evidence, because, I mean, there's a ton of evidence, but I'll just reiterate something here, that Christopher Busch, he allegedly confessed to polygraph examiner Larry Wasser, and his attorney is Jane Burgess, who's now deceased, during a pre-polygraph test on another case that Busch was involved in. This occurred regarding assaults that occurred in the 1970s. And I just told you about Patrick. Patrick Coffey was the person that knows the King family that eventually told Kathy about what happened. That's point number two. The polygraph. The polygraph, this was a colossal mistake by the Michigan State Police. It occurred, they polygraphed Busch and Green, who were in custody on another case. They polygraphed him 2 weeks before Timmy was abducted, and the polygrapher said that it was inconclusive or they weren't guilty, or they were telling the truth, in other words. 3 polygraph examiners have looked at those charges. 3 experienced polygraph examiners looked at those charges, and they said that he was wrong. This guy was, Busch and Green were deceptive and not telling the truth. So that is a colossal mistake, and This individual, apparently this polygrapher, was new, a rookie polygrapher, and certainly made a huge mistake. Then one of the victims, I call him source number 6, believes he was shown a picture of Timmy after he was deceased, and he believes it was Timmy. It was a picture of Timmy tied up in the Vega, which was Chris Busch's car. He had a couple of cars. One was a Blazer, and one was a Chevy Vega. Ironically, it was blue with a white stripe. So this source believes it was Timmy. And then what's interesting to note as well is that this source believed, let me read this, said that source number 6 told Sergeant Williams that Green had told him that Busch had killed a kid before in the woods up north. Okay, so why would these individuals talk about this if it wasn't true? I mean, they weren't in police custody. They had no reason to lie at that point. Let's see. I'm going to go on get a couple more points here. Then when Busch was interviewed by the police, he said that Busch and Green had these sexual fantasies about tying a kid up and abusing him. And from the autopsy reports, we know that Timmy's in particular, he had rope marks on his wrists. So everything seems to fit. I'll move on to the next page here. Regarding the Mark Stebbins murder, in fact, let me see. The key point of evidence there is when they went through the suicide scene, allegedly Chris Busch committed suicide, they found this sketch that looked like, most people believe, looked like Mark Stebbins. And the reason they said that was because when Mark Stebbins was abducted, he was wearing this coat that had a snorkel type coat and a hood. And it looks like in the sketch looks like that this boy is in severe pain. And it was pinned to the wall in Christopher Busch's room. Okay. Another key point, too, is Gregory Green, who was Busch's accomplice, stated that Green had told him about kids he molested in the past, and he'd gotten away with it. So why would Green tell his cellmate that he molested these kids and killed them and got away with it if it wasn't true? Again, he wasn't in police custody. He didn't have anything to gain by it. He just told his cellmate what happened. So again, this is circumstantial evidence. And this whole case is basically circumstantial evidence. And there's one part, this physical evidence that I'll get to. But it's solid circumstantial evidence. And then also, Green's brother stated that his brother, Greg Green, had told him that Green was frustrated with the fact that he told police back in 1977 that Christopher Busch was involved in killing those kids, and the police never believed him. So again, why would Gregory Green tell his brother that Busch killed Mark Stebbins if it wasn't true? He had no motive. There's no reason. So I think that's powerful evidence as well. And then Green had stated to police in the initial interviews that Chris Busch had killed Mark Stebbins. So I don't know why they didn't believe Gregory Green. They should have taken him at his word. And then let's see. There's another source who I identify as source number 5, told his cellmate that detectives, when source number 5 was 15 years old, source number 5 was associating with and was being molested by a guy that killed multiple kids. Again, we believe that's Chris Busch. This source stated that he believes source number 5 told the victims that were kids. Another thing, too, is Busch had access to kids through this Big Brother program, which was in Birmingham and Berkeley. Then Busch took one of his victims, which we identify as source number 7, to Tiny Tim's Hobby Shop and Hartfield's bowling alley several times. These are both abduction locations of the Oakland County child killing victims. And I mentioned before that Joe Robinson was believed to be abducted at near Tiny Tim's Hobby Shop. I mentioned too that Jill's bike was recovered there. And then also Christine Mihalik was abducted near Hartfield's bowling alley near the 7-Eleven in Berkeley. Let's see here. Busch also taught source number 7 how to use a shotgun at Busch's parents' cottage. This is where he took the kids. He took the kids up there to molest them. He was seen by locals up there as well. He was always with young kids, and they weren't his kids. Okay. Busch apparently tried to molest source number 7 at the cottage, but source number 7 fought him off. And then Jill Robinson was killed with a 12-gauge shotgun, so Busch knew how to handle a shotgun. Okay. Interesting, too, is that when source number 5 was in prison, he had some conversations with his sister, and these conversations were recorded. And I thought one of the key points there was that source number 5 said, and I'll back up a second, source number 5 was a victim, but we also think he's the one that turned as an accomplice. And apparently his hair, his mitochondrial DNA was found on Christine Mihalik's jacket. Okay. Now, as far as the key point of the conversation was, this is source number 5 talking to his sister, said, quote, "I wasn't there when it happened." After his sister told him that he had his DNA on one of the victim's shirts. And I comment, when what happened? Why would source number 5 say when it happened? There was something significant that happened. Let me see. Another key point, I'm going to skip down to the other recording, was on a recorded jail conversation with his sister, source number 5 asks his sister, talk to P, and that's his brother. His brother's name is Paul. He said, this is quote, "Get into his head and tell him try and think of one single time, I'll tell you what, I don't want to put this on him, I don't, but if it comes down to it, he's going to have to show his face up in court one day to me. He's going to have to. But I can't tell what. He would know. You know what I'm saying? He was with me. He was my shadow. You know that?" And that's all a quote. So he knows. This source number 5 is an experienced bad guy. He's been in prison before. He knows that his conversation is being recorded. So he's speaking in code to his sister. Okay. And then another thing is back to Busch for a second. Busch molested his nephews, and he also took one of his nephews to the exact spot in the parking lot where Timmy was abducted. And specifically, he said, referring to Timmy, he was standing right over there. I don't think anybody knows, besides the abductors and the killers, where Timmy was abducted exactly. Nobody was that specific. So how did he get this knowledge? Again, circumstantial evidence. And then it really bothered the nephew, and he told police that as well. That kind of hits the highlights of the circumstantial evidence. Again, the physical evidence is the mitochondrial DNA that was found on Christine Mihalik's jacket, and that the DNA matches what we call source number 5.